Okay, my camera cut out, by the way. That's why this part is separate for some reason. Anyway, the Ken Anderson interview. It was on the pwrshow.com. I'll put the link in the sidebar. It was a really good interview. Mr. Kennedy had a reputation for being totally outspoken, a bit of a prick, but for me he was always just destroying his own career rather than other people's, and I think that's forgivable. So yeah, this was interesting. He talked a lot about the backstage dynamics, which I found really entertaining actually. It's a really long interview. He clearly does like the sound of his own voice, but it's fairly good, so I would check that out. Anyway, he started talking about how he believed Randy Orton, he basically intimated Randy Orton was responsible for his release, and saying he didn't botch that suplex and stuff like this, and he wasn't injured. And he was talking about how when he came to the studio that morning he got a really weird vibe from Randy Orton because those two were supposed to be friends, and he seemed a bit annoyed at Orton in general. And then he talked about the dynamics backstage. He described it as two mountains, basically, right? He said there's a mountain which contains people like The Undertaker, Rey Mysterio, Finlay, these people who... It gave me new respect for Finlay, actually. These people who believe that, in order to make the wrestling business good, in order to make the wrestling business profitable, so it is for their own interests, but it's also, for the good of wrestling. You've got to put people over, you've got to make people look good. I was actually kind of surprised The Undertaker was in this group, because he's not exactly known for putting people over, but whatever. You've got to make your opponent look good, etc, etc. That's how he described that group. And then he said there was another group which was headed by Triple H, and it was intimated that John Cena and Randy Orton were also involved, who would just throw stones down the side of the mountain to make sure no one came up and stole their spot. Which I found really interesting. And then he started talking about how Vince has his own favourites and all this, and how there are certain people who go to brunch with Vince and who work out with him, at which point I almost vomited, who get special treatment. He talks about all sorts of things. He talks about the writers in WWE, how they're how they basically just tell you to say what's on the sheet. They don't allow you to be creative. They don't allow you to develop your character. And he describes the whole writing process as kind of chaotic backstage, and yeah, it just sounded terrible, and it explains quite a lot about why the product's so stagnant. So I'd really recommend checking out that. I thought it was really good. I've got a few Q&A questions, and I will be doing Q&A on these videos every week. Just from Natman22, who sent me these in a personal message, so I just thought I'd rattle them off quickly. So please send your personal message, send your Q&A questions to personal messages, and I'll answer them, or Bobby will answer them on shows. Anyway, what is the worst finisher / signature you've ever seen? The worst finishing move I've ever seen is Tito Santana's flying forearm finisher. It's just the definition of what a finisher is not. It doesn't look impactful in any way. You've got to check it out. It's just totally crap. I mean, you could say stuff like Crush's heart punch, but then at least the heart punch kind of made sense, that there's a logic to that, like there's a logic to the Samoan spike. The flying forearm was just fucking abysmal, so that's my answer to that. Did you like the TLC match between Cena and Edge at Unforgiven 2006? I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was great. The crowd were quite into it. It was kind of a weird crowd because it was in Canada, as I recall. Am I thinking of the right one? So they were kind of cheering for Edge and they were kind of cheering for Cena, and it was all over the place. The match was quite good. Lita got involved a lot, which I didn't particularly... I never really liked that. But I thought it was a good match. It's definitely not the best match they've had. But generally they've had a very good feud, I think. Like, people complain about seeing Cena versus Randy Orton versus Triple H in the main event on Raw, and they're right, because their matches are really bad. Their feuds are really bad. John Cena versus Edge is a great feud. I'd happily see it over and over and over again. And their match at Backlash this year was a sensational match. Really, really good. I think it's my third favourite match this year. It was a brilliant match. But yeah. 3, do you die a little inside when Todd Grisham opens his mouth? Of course, I'm only human. I also vomit a little, so, so yeah. Okay, turn over to part 4. Unfortunately, part 4 would have been part 3 if I'd planned this correctly, where I'll give out the Kazarni We Hardly Knew Ye awards for this week.